Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to unpack something truly monumental. This silent, immense power constantly at work beneath our feet, reshaping our world in ways that have profoundly influenced, well, the whole human story.
Yeah.
Imagine a force so powerful it can instantly lift or sink entire coastlines, shift ancient migration routes, even dictate the fate of isolated human communities. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think
That's
about it.
absolutely right. And our mission today really is to uncover these profound, often quite surprising ways our planet's dynamics influence human experience, challenge our assumptions.
Okay.
We'll explore the cutting-edge science of measuring these Earth movements, then connect these huge geological forces to the sweeping narratives of human evolution, the rise and fall of ancient civilizations,
Right.
and even, contemporary societal dilemmas, like the
Yeah.
really complex ethical stuff surrounding how we interact with, or maybe choose not to interact with, some of the most isolated human communities on Earth.
And to guide us through this incredible journey, we've drawn from, well, a really fascinating array of sources. We're looking at everything from precision, cutting-edge satellite data, like the stuff used in studies of seismic deformation,
Yeah, the high-tech side.
to ancient historical accounts that really capture the human experience of these events. We've even dug into detailed anthropological studies and critical analyses of environmental theories.
So it's a real mix.
It's a truly interdisciplinary deep dive, blending geoscience with human history and anthropology. It should be fascinating. So let's start literally from the ground up. When we talk about these immense forces, the immediate impact of an earthquake is maybe the most visceral.
Definitely.
We often hear about the shaking, but what's actually happening to the land itself during an earthquake, like right then? How do scientists describe that instant change?
What's truly fascinating here is the concept of seismic deformation.
Seismic deformation.
Okay, right. This term refers to the immediate or near instantaneous physical displacement of the ground. It happens directly as a fault ruptures during the quake.
So not just the shaking we feel.
Exactly. That's the seismic waves moving through the Earth. This is different. It's the actual permanent movement of the Earth's surface and even the subsurface.
Permanent movement, wow.
Yeah, and this physical movement can show up in several pretty dramatic ways. You might witness uplift, where the ground literally rises, sometimes by several meters.
Just pops up.
Pretty much. Conversely, there's subsidence, where the ground sinks.
Okay.
And then there's horizontal displacement. That's the sideways movement of land masses along a fault line.
Like shuffling past each other.
Exactly. But it's not just about surface movement. There are also subtle yet significant internal density changes, which we call dilatation.
Dilatation.
Yeah, within the crust and mantle itself. It reflects areas where the rock gets compressed or decompressed as all that stress is suddenly released.
Huh. So it's not just one thing, is it? It's a whole spectrum of physical changes happening all at once with an earthquake.
Precisely.
And these movements are all tied to different kinds of geological faults, aren't they? Could you sort of walk us through the main ones and the specific stresses that create them?
Absolutely. The particular type of ground movement we see is directly linked to the kind of fault that breaks and the underlying tectonic stresses involved.
Right.
So first, we encounter normal faults. These typically form in regions where the Earth's crust is under tension.
Tension, like it's being pulled apart.
Exactly. Stretched thin. Imagine trying to stretch, I don't know, a piece of dough. It thins out and eventually breaks.
Okay.
In a normal fault, the block of rock located above the fault plane, and we geologists call it the hanging wall, it slides downward relative to the footwall, which is the block underneath.
Hanging wall down, footwall stays put, relatively.
You got it. And this process effectively lengthens the crust. It often leads to the formation of things like rift valleys.
Okay, so that's tension. And on the flip side of that, you must have compression, right? Where the crust is being pushed together.
Precisely. That brings us to reverse faults. Sometimes they're called thrust faults, especially when the angle of the fault plane is really shallow, like less than 45 degrees.
Reverse or thrust, okay.
These are characteristic of areas experiencing intense compression, where the Earth's crust is being squeezed or pushed together.
Like pushing two rugs together on the floor. One buckles up.
That's a great analogy. The hanging wall moves up relative to the footwall, so it effectively shortens and thickens the crust.
Ah.
And these types of faults are particularly significant because their vertical movement, especially when they happen under the ocean in subduction zones,
Right, the big ones offshore.
they can displace enormous volumes of water. This sudden vertical shift of the seafloor is the main way devastating tsunamis get generated. All that displaced water has to go somewhere, right? It propagates outwards as these massive waves.
Scary stuff. And then there's a third major type, one that doesn't involve so much up or down, but more of a sideways motion.
That would be strike-slip faults. These occur under sheer stress.
Sheer stress?
Yeah, where two blocks of rock slide past each other horizontally with minimal vertical movement. The most famous example, everyone knows it, is the San Andreas Fault in California,
Right.
where the Pacific Plate is sliding northwestward past the North American Plate.
So understanding these different faults and how the ground moves the seismic deformation, that's critical, isn't it? Not just for figuring out immediate damage.
Absolutely critical. It's not just for assessing the immediate damage to buildings, roads, infrastructure, economic resources, all that. This information also gives us crucial insights into the extent of slip along the plate boundary.
Which helps predict future quakes.
It helps, yes. It's vital for predicting future seismic activity and identifying if a major earthquake might trigger ruptures on, say, secondary faults nearby, or maybe previously unmapped structures in the upper plate.
Oh, like a domino effect.
Kind of. For instance, the MWW 6.9 Pichilemu fault earthquake in Chile. That was triggered just 11 days after the massive 2010 Mal earthquake.
Wow.
A classic example of a large event influencing adjacent fault systems. What's remarkable is how these seemingly distinct types of ground movement, uplift, subsidence, sideways slip, they're all interconnected parts of the Earth's relentless effort to relieve internal stress. Each leaves its unique geological fingerprint, telling a story of immense power.
So we've outlined what happens during these seismic events. But the real challenge must be measuring these changes, right? Especially since they can be incredibly subtle sometimes or happen in really remote, inaccessible places.
That's a huge challenge.
How do scientists actually take the pulse of our planet in these scenarios? What are the tools, both the really high-tech ones and maybe some surprisingly low-tech ones, that let us observe Earth's shifting skin?
Yeah, this is where the ingenuity of modern geodesy, the science of measuring Earth's shape and gravity field, truly shines. We rely on a whole sophisticated suite of geodetic methods and sensors to quantify these massive, yet often widely spread out ground movements.
Okay, like what? GPS.
On the high-tech side, GPS, the Global Positioning System, is absolutely indispensable. It provides absolute three-dimensional measurements of displacement at specific points on the Earth's surface.
Like super precise surveying from space.
Exactly. Think of it like an incredibly precise surveyor's tool. But instead of using a local benchmark, it's linked to a constellation of satellites orbiting Earth. We use continuous GPS stations, these are permanently installed, recording ground positions daily.
So you get a constant stream of data.
Yeah, providing detailed time series of land level changes. They're used extensively across active tectonic regions like Chile. Then there are also campaign GPS benchmarks.
Campaign GPS.
This is where researchers survey specific points before and after an event using portable receivers, like Trimble GPS units. It lets them precisely track the shift over a shorter, targeted period, focusing on the earthquake's impact.
Okay, GPS makes sense. But what about something like InSAR? That sounds very futuristic, almost sci-fi.
InSAR, or Interferometric Synthetic Aperture Radar, is pretty remarkable. It offers a powerful complement to the point-based GPS data.
How does that work?
It's a satellite-based remote sensing technique that measures relative surface movement over wide areas. It's quite clever how it works.
Okay.
The satellite sends out radar signals to the Earth's surface. Then it detects minute changes in the phase, sort of the timing of the returning signal between two different satellite passes over the exact same area, often weeks apart.
Comparing before and after images with radar.
Exactly. By comparing these two radar images, scientists can create these incredibly intricate maps of ground deformation, showing areas of uplift or subsidence with extremely high precision, down to just a few millimeters sometimes.
Millimeters. From space.
Yeah. But it does have limitations. It measures relative movement, meaning it tells you how much one point has moved relative to another point in the image.
Not absolute movement like GPS.
Correct. And it requires clear atmospheric conditions. Clouds, water vapor, they can interfere with the radar signals.
Okay, so GPS for points, InSAR for wide areas. What else? You mentioned GRACE. That measures gravity itself. How does that fit into measuring ground movement?
Yes, GRACE, the Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment satellites, offers a truly unique perspective. It's quite different.
How so?
GRACE doesn't directly measure ground displacement on the surface like GPS or InSAR. Instead, it measures subtle changes in Earth's gravity field.
Gravity changes because of an earthquake.
Exactly. When an earthquake causes massive ground displacement, whether it's uplift or subsidence, it fundamentally redistributes mass within the Earth.
Right. Moving rock around changes the local mass.
Precisely. Imagine a mountain rising or a valley sinking. That's a shift in where the mass is located. These changes in mass, even deep within the Earth's crust and mantle, they actually alter the local gravitational pull just slightly.
And GRACE can detect that.
Yes. GRACE detects this coseismic deformation by measuring these minute variations in gravity as its twin satellites fly over. What's particularly powerful about GRACE is its ability to capture not only the uplift and subsidence, which are essentially surface mass shifts,
Yeah.
but also those internal density changes, the dilatation within the crust and mantle caused by the fault rupture itself.
So it sees deeper effects too.
It does. This provides crucial independent constraints on essential faulting parameters, like the fault's precise length, width, depth, and the total amount of slip that occurred.
How do they pull that specific signal out of all the gravity data?
They use advanced mathematical techniques, things like Slepian functions for spatiospectral localization.
Okay, that sounds complex.
It is. Think of them as highly sophisticated mathematical filters. They help pinpoint and isolate the specific areas of deformation from broader gravitational signals, allowing scientists to map out the fault zones with remarkable accuracy. GRACE really gives us a deeper, broader view, peering into the Earth's interior effects.
That's incredible. So GRACE gives us this global, comprehensive picture from space. But what about the vast stretches of the ocean floor? That's where some of the biggest quakes happen, right? Subduction zones. How do we get data from there?
That's a critical piece of the puzzle. For those crucial insights into seafloor deformation, especially vital for understanding subduction zones, we turn to seafloor geodesy.
Seafloor geodesy. Okay.
These are specialized techniques like those developed and deployed after the truly massive 2011 Tohoku Oki earthquake in Japan. Researchers like Sato and colleagues made observations at seafloor stations, like one called MYGW.
What do these techniques involve?
They can involve acoustic transponders, basically sound beacons placed on the seafloor that communicate with surface vessels equipped with GPS, or sometimes bottom pressure recorders. These systems provide crucial data on both horizontal and vertical displacements directly on the ocean floor.
Ah, so connecting seafloor instruments to satellites via ships.
Essentially, yes. This complements the land-based GPS data beautifully, offering a more complete and accurate picture of what happens during these massive offshore subduction zone events, which, as you said, are often the source of devastating tsunamis.
That's incredibly advanced tech, getting measurements down to millimeters.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned surprisingly low-tech tools earlier. What could possibly measure ground displacement without satellites or complex electronics?
This is where it gets really interesting, I think, and it highlights the ingenuity of interdisciplinary science blending biology with geology.
Biology. How?
We can use intertidal biota, basically the living organisms found on rocky shores, as biological benchmarks.
Living benchmarks like barnacles.
Exactly like barnacles. Think about organisms like certain types of algae, barnacles, specifically a species called Gelius serratus, and mussels, like Pyramidilus purpuratus. These species have very distinct upper vertical distribution limits.
Meaning they only live up to a certain height on the shore.
Precisely. Their upper limit is directly tied to sea levels, specifically tidal heights. They literally cannot survive above a certain point. Their whole physiology and life cycle are adapted to specific amounts of exposure to air versus water.
Okay. So how does that help measure earthquake movement?
Well, if an earthquake causes rapid land level changes, either uplift or subsidence, these organisms' distribution limits will suddenly shift relative to the new sea level, or they'll show clear signs of stress and death.
Ah. So if the land lifts up suddenly, their old high tide mark is now too high. They're out of the water too much and die off.
Exactly. You'd see a clear band of dead or dying organisms marking the old upper limit, now stranded high and dry. Or, conversely, if the land sinks, areas that were formerly dry at low tide might now be permanently submerged. Land-adapted species die off, and new marine organisms might start colonizing lower down.
That's clever. So you can literally walk the coastline after a quake and map the changes by looking at the seaweed and barnacles.
Pretty much. The key advantages are that it offers a quick, observable assessment of the rupture length and displacement, especially vertical displacement. And it's incredibly useful in remote or inaccessible coastal areas where deploying traditional GPS or other instruments might be difficult or impossible right after an event.
Are there downsides? Is it always accurate?
Of course, it has limitations. You're relying on biological responses, which can be influenced by other environmental factors too, like temperature extremes or wave action unrelated to the quake. But studies, like those from Chile we'll talk about, have shown species like that barnacle, Gelia serratus, have consistently high recruitment rates right up to the upper tidal level. This makes their upper limits surprisingly reliable indicators for seismic coastal deformation, especially for measuring uplift.
Wow.
This low-tech approach really reveals that even the most advanced science often benefits from surprisingly simple, observable natural phenomena. It reminds us that nature itself can be a powerful sensor if you know how to read it.
That's truly remarkable. Okay, let's bring these tools and concepts to life.
Yeah.
Can you give us some real-world case studies? How have these diverse methods, the GPS, the satellites, the barnacles, actually been applied to recent seismic events? How do they give us a clear picture?
Yeah, absolutely. We have several compelling examples that really illustrate the power of combining these approaches. Let's take the 2014 Iquique earthquake in Chile. This was a magnitude 8.2 event off the northern coast.
Okay, big one.
A big one. And it caused observable, significant land level changes along a wide stretch of the coast. Researchers, people like Jaramillo and Melmix, supported by Chilean and German science foundations, along with their colleagues Baez, Montechino, Lagos, Acuna, Manzano, they used a multi-method approach.
Combining everything.
Pretty much. Their findings revealed complex deformation patterns. For instance, they measured subsidence sinking ranging from 3 to 9 centimeters at a site called core zones. But further north, Pisagua, along about a 100-kilometer stretch, the sinking was much more dramatic,
Sure.
30 to 50 centimeters.
Half a meter in places.
Yeah. But interestingly, the southern part of the rupture near a place called Shanabaya actually experienced about 15 centimeters of uplift.
Wait, so different areas along the same fault rupture experienced very different vertical movements. Some sank, some lifted, all at the same time.
Precisely. It's often not uniform. This complex pattern of deformation was meticulously mapped using that combination of techniques we talked about. Traditional stainless steel benchmarks installed in the rock, continuous GPS stations running constantly, campaign GPS surveys done before and after, and crucially, those intertidal organisms.
The biological benchmarks again.
Exactly. For instance, at Pisagua Norte, measurements of the mussel Peromytilus purpuratus show a subsidence of effective 36.6 centimeters in April 2014, just after the quake. At Pisagua Sur, the same mussel species indicated minus 41.8 centimeters of subsidence.
So the mussels confirmed the sinking measured by other methods.
They did. And the detailed maps generated from all this data showing the epicenters, the benchmarks, the continuous GPS stations, all color-coded by the amount of uplift or subsidence they provide, this vivid visual representation of the whole deformation field. It allows scientists to really understand the underlying fault geometry and how the slip was distributed along the fault during the earthquake.
That detailed, multi-layered mapping must be absolutely essential for understanding the full impact and the physics of these huge events. What about other major earthquakes, especially ones that really tested those advanced satellite technologies like GRACE?
Indeed. The 2010 Mal earthquake, an even larger magnitude 8.8 event, also in Chile, was a crucial real-world test for the GRACE satellites.
Did they work? Could they see it?
They did. They successfully detected significant coseismic gravity changes from this enormous event, which not only validated their utility but also provided independent insights into the complex faulting mechanisms deep within the Earth. And importantly, the GRACE results align remarkably well with seismic models derived from other data sources, like GPS and seismology.
So it confirmed GRACE's unique capability.
Yes, its ability to see that mass redistribution, both at the surface and deeper within the Earth's interior. Then, of course, there's the truly massive 2011 Tohoku-oki earthquake in Japan, a magnitude 9.1 megathrust event.
Just enormous.
Unprecedented in modern instrumentation, really. This earthquake showcased an incredible level of ground displacement. Land-based GPS data from the Geospatial Information Authority of Japan, the GSI, combined with those seafloor geodetic observations documented by Sato and colleagues at sites like MYGW, They predicted and then confirmed truly enormous horizontal and vertical displacements.
How big are we talking?
In some cases, over 50 meters, that's over 160 feet of horizontal slip, occurred on the fault plane deep beneath the ocean.
50 meters.
Yeah, it's almost hard to comprehend. This event profoundly showcased the devastating power of subduction zone events, particularly their capacity to generate those colossal tsunamis that can travel across entire ocean basins, causing destruction thousands of miles away.
And historically, we've seen these kinds of dramatic land level changes before, haven't we? Sometimes with really long-lasting ecological consequences, like the 1964 Alaska earthquake. That sounds like it literally reshaped the landscape.
Oh, absolutely. The 1964 Alaska earthquake, a magnitude 8.4 to 8.6 event, remains one of the most dramatic examples of coseismic land level change ever recorded in North America.
What happened there?
The entire Copper River Delta, this vast glaciated coastal wetland area, was uplifted by an astonishing 1.8 to 3.4 meters, almost
9
instantly.
feet, centimeters.
Meters, between 6 and 11 feet of uplift across a huge area. This instantaneous geological event fundamentally reshaped the landscape. Subtidal areas are normally underwater, even at low tide, were suddenly exposed and became intertidal zones.
Wow.
And existing intertidal areas were transformed into supertidal zones, basically new dry land above the high tide line. It fundamentally altered the whole tidal regime and exposed vast new stretches of land.
So areas that were underwater were suddenly land, and what was beach became like meadow, all in a matter of minutes. What were the ecological consequences of such a massive, sudden shift?
The ecological consequences were profound and immediate. It led to a completely altered pattern of plant succession. For example, in those newly created supertidal areas, the sudden exposure to air and the lack of tidal flooding caused widespread death of marine and salt-tolerant intertidal plant species.
Makes sense. They couldn't survive out of the water.
Right. Then, over time, vegetation began shifting from those salt-tolerant herbaceous species to shrub-dominated communities as terrestrial plants started colonizing the new higher ground. However, an important insight from John F. Thelenius's extensive work on this event, he studied it for decades, is that the uplift altered locations and rates but not the nature of wetland plant succession.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning, while the dramatic uplift accelerated and repositioned these ecological processes, the types of successional changes, the sequence of plant communities replacing each other over time, were consistent with what would normally happen in such wetlands, just on an unprecedented scale and speed.
So the process was the same, just faster and shifted geographically.
Exactly. We saw specific changes in plant communities, like the initial decline of a sedge called Carex lingmeae in low marsh areas, followed by the establishment of shrubs like myricagale becoming prevalent on the higher levees that were now less frequently flooded.
Did it affect animals too?
Oh, definitely. It had cascading impacts. For instance, Canada geese, which had actually been introduced to the Delta in the late 1950s, they adapted their grazing patterns. They shifted to feed more intensely on the foliage and root systems of that Carex lingmeae sedge in the newly formed marshes.
So they focused on the surviving patches.
Their grazing pressure was so significant in some areas that it created this evenly mowed appearance at the sedge's seaward edge. It's a fascinating example of how even decades later, the initial seismic event continues to shape the ecosystem and influence the behavior of its inhabitants.
That's a perfect illustration, yeah. How a single geological event can have such complex ripple effects across an entire ecosystem, influencing everything from plants to animal feeding habits. And speaking of long-term impacts and future hazards, what about the Cascadia subduction zone off the Pacific Northwest coast of the U.S. and Canada that's often described as a ticking time bomb?
The Cascadia subduction zone is indeed one of the most significant seismic hazards globally, precisely because it is currently locked and accumulating immense strain.
Lock.
Meaning the plates aren't smoothly sliding past each other, they're stuck. The 600-mile-long fault runs just offshore from British Columbia down to northern California. It's a megathrust fault, capable of producing truly immense earthquakes magnitude 9.0 or higher. And along with those quakes, devastating tsunamis.
Do we know when the last big one was?
We do, thanks to extensive geological evidence like tsunami sand layers, drowned coastal forests, and also the invaluable oral histories of indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest. The last major event was a 1700 Cascadia earthquake, We know the date quite precisely because it generated a tsunami so powerful it traveled across the Pacific and was clearly recorded in historical accounts in Japan. They called it the orphan tsunami because they felt no earthquake beforehand.
Wow. So it's been over 300 years.
As of, well, mid-2024, it has been 324 years since that last major rupture. That means a significant and growing amount of seismic strain has built up along the locked portion of the subduction zone.
Which means?
It indicates a very large seismic gap and a high probability of a future rupture. It's a major concern for millions living in cities like Seattle, Portland, Vancouver.
Is there anything we can learn from how people dealt with past events there?
Absolutely. What's particularly instructive from this region is how historical ecological responses of people, like the Klallam tribe, can actually inform modern preparedness.
Yes.
After a large tsunami hit their area around the 15th century, archaeological evidence from a village site called Seywitzen shows the Klallam shifted their diet. They started relying much more heavily on Pacific herring when salmon, which was usually a staple, became scarce.
Why herring?
Well, herring habitats, like eelgrass beds in shallow coastal areas, tend to recover much faster from tsunami damage than the complex river systems that salmon depend on. So they adapted their food gathering strategies based on the environmental disruption.
That's fascinating.
It highlights how deep historical adaptations to environmental upheaval can offer crucial lessons for contemporary disaster planning and building resilience today. Understanding how people successfully navigated past catastrophes can inform how we prepare for future ones.
Moving from that immediate impact and future hazards to the longer-term consequences.
Yeah.
How do ecosystems typically recover after such catastrophic events? Especially something as dramatic as that sudden coastal uplift we saw in Alaska, or potentially in New Zealand. Is it a quick bounce back, or can there be permanent fundamental changes?
That raises a profoundly important question about ecological recovery post-disaster. Large-scale catastrophic events like significant earthquakes causing massive land level changes, they don't just cause temporary disruption, they can fundamentally reset the structure and functioning of ecosystems.
Reset them.
Yeah, and potentially lead to what ecologists call different stable states, meaning the ecosystem might not simply return to its original form, but instead reorganize into something entirely new, perhaps with different dominant species or ecological processes.
So it doesn't just bounce back to exactly how it was before.
Not necessarily. A compelling and frankly concerning case study comes from southeastern New Zealand after a magnitude 7.8 earthquake there. This event caused astonishing coastal uplift in some places by up to 6 meters.
6 meters, that's huge, nearly 20 feet.
Staggering. And it led to widespread mortality of intertidal communities. Both algae and invertebrates died off over a vast stretch of 130 kilometers of coastline. Basically, everything living between the high and low tide marks was wiped out or severely damaged.
Good grief. What were the specific challenges to recovery in that environment? You mentioned a kind of perfect storm of factors hindering it.
Indeed, it was a multifaceted challenge, and the recovery, even after 4 years when the study was done, was generally poor, especially at the sites that experienced the highest uplift. Several factors conspired against it.
Like what?
First, the newly exposed reefs experienced lethal temperatures. They frequently soared above 35 degrees Celsius, that's 95 Fahrenheit, and even reached an astonishing 50 degrees Celsius, 122 Fahrenheit, in direct sunlight.
Wow, that would cook anything trying to live there.
Exactly. It was deadly for any remnant populations of intertidal organisms, and it basically prevented new algal recruits from establishing. Second, there was significant erosion of the soft sedimentary rocks that formed the reefs. The very ground, the substrate for life, was unstable. And shifting sand and gravel frequently covered some of the lower reef areas during storms, literally smothering any organisms trying to settle.
So the physical environment itself was hostile.
Very. Third, the nearshore light environment was compromised. Even though the land was lifted, sediment plumes from erosion and other factors meant the water was often too murky. The light levels were often below the minimum required for algal production, especially for the large habitat-forming seaweeds, the fucoids, like Durvillea, Antarctica, or Poha. These are key species, providing shelter and food for countless other creatures.
So hostile temperatures, unstable ground, not enough light. What about the organisms themselves? Did their biology play a role in this really slow recovery?
Absolutely. The life histories, the way these dominant species reproduce and disperse, were a major impediment. Those large brown algal assemblages, mostly the fucoids, were devastated. And these organisms generally have limited dispersal distances of their propagules.
Propagules, like spores or larvae.
Exactly. They typically only travel a matter of meters from the parent plant. For long-distance recolonization, they heavily rely on drifting, reproductively active adult plants washing ashore.
So if a whole 130-kilometer stretch is wiped out,
There's a critical lack of nearby sources for reseeding. Because the surviving populations after the earthquake were so patchy, the connectivity to the previously occupied areas was severely compromised. That species Durvalea, for instance, is also dioecious.
meaning male and female plants.
Yes, separate male and female plants. So it requires both male and female fronds to arrive in close proximity and reproduce together. And this has to happen during their relatively short, about 8-week reproductive season in winter.
That sounds like a low probability event.
It really stacks the odds against recovery. Furthermore, the Durvalea, sporelings, the tiny, newly germinated microscopic plants, are highly vulnerable to heat stress, which was a critical issue with those newly exposed hot reef surfaces we mentioned.
Okay, so limited dispersal, need both sexes, babies are vulnerable, anything else?
Yes. Compounding all of this, there was an increased abundance of fleshy red algae. These seemed to quickly colonize the disturbed bare areas, and in turn, they appeared to prevent the recruitment of the large brown algae, maybe by outcompeting them for space or light. It seemed to create this self-reinforcing, different stable state dominated by red algae instead of the original brown algae forest.
That really does sound like a perfect storm of challenges hindering recovery. What does this detailed New Zealand study teach us more broadly about how to respond to such extreme environmental shifts, maybe in the context of climate change too?
The broader implications are profound, I think. It underscores how complex and multifactorial ecological recovery can be after severe, large-scale disturbances, especially when coupled with other ongoing environmental stressors. The study itself says it's instructive for attempts to lessen manageable stressors in coastal environments and help future-proof against the effects of compounded impacts.
So we need to think about multiple stressors at once.
Exactly. In an era of increasing climatic extremes and more frequent severe weather events, understanding how these ecosystems respond to catastrophic geological events is vital for developing effective management strategies. It tells us that simply leaving nature to bounce back might not be enough sometimes.
We might need to intervene.
We may need to actively intervene, perhaps by facilitating dispersal of key species, or maybe by mitigating other stressors like pollution or overfishing to help these vulnerable coastal environments adapt and recover against future shocks. The key insight here is that major geological events don't just change the land, they can fundamentally resculpt entire ecosystems, potentially pushing them toward new and sometimes less resilient or less diverse states. It's another reminder of the planet's powerful long-term influence on life.
Okay, so from the immediate aftermath of a quake and its ecological ripple effects, let's zoom way out now, back into deep time. It's truly incredible to think how these planetary forces haven't just shaped landscapes, but have also profoundly influenced human evolution and migration across millennia. What evidence do we have for that, especially thinking about volcanic activity?
What's truly fascinating here is the potential link between colossal volcanic activity and the very emergence and spread of our own species, Homo sapiens. Researchers, people like David Pyle and Will Hutchison at Oxford, have highlighted the Ethiopian Rift Valley as a key area for this.
The Rift Valley, right? A cradle of human evolution.
Exactly. This region experienced a really dramatic period between about 320,000 and 170,000 years ago. During that time, 4 volcanoes within this rift underwent truly colossal eruptions.
How big are we talking?
We're talking about events possibly on the scale of the 1883 Krakatoa eruption, which, as you know, dramatically affected global climate. These ancient eruptions would have just buried the rift floor in vast amounts of volcanic ejecta ash, pumice, lava flows. They formed large calderas, the collapsed craters, and would have dramatically disrupted essential water sources, river systems, and prime habitats across huge areas.
And this intense pulse in volcanism coincides with a really pivotal moment in human history, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The very arrival of Homo sapiens on the scene.
It does. This period of intense volcanism intriguingly coincides with the earliest widely accepted evidence for the arrival of Homo sapiens in that region, around 200,000 years ago.
So what's the connection? How might eruptions have influenced us?
Well, it raises profound questions. Did the volcanic activity create geographic barriers, maybe isolating small populations of early humans, which could have led to unique adaptations or accelerated evolutionary divergence?
Or maybe push them in new directions?
Exactly. Or did it drive populations to innovate? Finding new ways to exploit disrupted resources or survive in more challenging altered landscapes. And certainly, it would have significantly influenced early human migration routes out of Africa. It could have channeled early dispersals along less impacted corridors or forced populations to find entirely new pathways.
So our ancestors were navigating a much more dynamic world than we might picture.
It suggests our earliest ancestors were dealing with a far more geologically active and volatile landscape than we typically imagine. A world where adaptation to dynamic environmental change wasn't just beneficial, it was paramount for survival.
That's incredible. To think that environmental pressure could literally spur evolution or new survival strategies. And it's not just ancient history, is it? We've seen how major eruptions have had global, immediate, and lasting effects on human populations, even in relatively recent history, leading to mass migrations. The Tambora eruption is a perfect example, right?
Yes, the 1815 Tambora volcano eruption in Indonesia stands as a stark reminder of the global reach these geological forces can have. This was one of the largest eruptions in recorded history.
What did it do?
It injected an enormous volume of ash, sulfur dioxide, and other gases high into the stratosphere. The consequences were truly global. These aerosols circulated worldwide, acting like a veil, reflecting sunlight, and causing dramatic drops in average global temperatures.
Leading to the year without a summer.
Exactly. It led directly to what became infamously known as the Year Without a Summer in 1816. In Germany, for example, the summer of 1816 was almost 5 degrees Celsius below historical averages. That's a massive deviation.
5 degrees, that would be devastating.
It was. It resulted in widespread crop failures across Europe, devastating landslides because of excessive, persistent rainfall, and consequently, immense hunger, misery, and social unrest for the population. Livestock died, food prices skyrocketed, famines were widespread. It was a catastrophe.
And the direct connection to human movement, specifically mass migration, is really striking here, isn't it?
It is, powerfully so. This adverse climate directly triggered the first significant wave of German migration to America.
Because of the eruption.
Directly linked. The situation was so dire, with widespread starvation and social breakdown, that authorities in some German states, totally overwhelmed by the crisis, actually promoted emigration for their poorest citizens.
They paid people to leave.
Effectively, yes. They saw it as a more cost-effective solution than dealing with spiraling welfare costs for the starting population and the potential for social rebellion.
Wow. Was this happening in isolation or part of a bigger trend?
This wasn't an isolated incident, really. It occurred within the broader context of the Little Ice Age, which was a period from roughly 1300 to 1850, characterized by generally cooler, more unstable climate with common poor harvests. So Tambora hit during an already difficult climatic period.
And other migration waves followed, also linked to environment.
Yes, subsequent migration waves from Germany were also closely linked to environmental and economic pressures. For example, a particularly hot and dry summer in 1846 led to another wave due to widespread crop failures and soaring food prices.
So extreme weather, again.
Right. This was then compounded by an economic crisis between 1848 and 1854, sometimes called the Panic of 1847 in Europe, and then the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856. During the war, France and other European states banned food exports to preserve their own supplies, putting even further pressure on German grain markets.
So a combination of climate, economics, politics.
This confluence of environmental adversity, political chaos, and economic hardship triggered the last really significant migration wave of Germans and also many Irish in the 19th century. The key insight here is how seemingly distant geological events, like an eruption in Indonesia, can cascade through the global climate system to profoundly reshape human demography and historical trajectories across continents.
That's a sobering thought, yeah. Seeing how deeply environmental instability can fuel human migration, even across centuries. And this dynamic, this pattern of environmental instability driving human movement, it has a very modern analogy, doesn't it? Especially when we think about human-caused climate change. It suggests history might be repeating itself, maybe on an even larger scale.
This raises an important and, frankly, urgent question. If historical climate shifts, Even those caused by natural volcanic activity fueled such significant mass migrations. What does that imply for our future?
Right.
Modern climate change, largely driven by anthropogenic CO2 emissions from burning fossil fuels and other human activities, is projected to continue for centuries. It's fundamentally altering our planet's climate patterns. And it is widely predicted to fuel future conflicts and mass migrations as global crop harvests become increasingly volatile and unpredictable.
Have we seen examples of that already?
We've already seen glimpses. For example, the severe 2010 droughts in Russia, coupled with unusually intense storms in Europe, caused a devastating 20% loss in the global crop harvest that year.
20% loss globally.
Globally. Then China, facing its own poor harvest, decided to stock up on crops, which led to further shortages on the international market. This in turn caused rising bread costs, which led to food riots and political turmoil in many African countries. And that directly contributed to mass migration and displacement.
So it's a chain reaction. Climate event, crop failure, market instability, social unrest, migration.
Exactly. This cycle of environmental disruption, resource scarcity, and human displacement is not merely a historical footnote. It's a pressing contemporary and future challenge. It forces us to consider how our actions today, impacting the climate, might shape the demographic map of tomorrow.
It's a stark reminder of our deep interconnectedness with planetary systems.
Yeah.
But let's go back even further again to the very earliest human expansions out of Africa. How did climate and environment influence those incredibly ancient global journeys? And how do researchers even begin to unravel those pathways across such deep time? It seems impossible.
Well, the widely accepted out-of-Africa theory posits that groups of Homo sapiens left Africa more than 70,000 years ago. And eventually, they spread across Europe, Asia, Australia, and the Americas, colonizing every habitable continent.
Right.
But for a long time, it was really unclear how much the specific environments they encountered, the terrain, the climate, the resources available, actually facilitated or hindered their journeys. Were they just pushing out randomly, or were they following specific paths?
How do you figure that out from so long ago?
Recent groundbreaking research by Frederick Saltra, Corey Bradshaw, and Bastian Lamas has provided fascinating new insights. Their work on global migration pathways is truly unique because it robustly combines multiple lines of evidence.
Like what?
They looked at archaeological data, like dated sites where human remains or artifacts were found. They looked at genetic evidence, specifically using something called the fixation index of mitochondrial DNA.
Mitochondrial DNA. That's passed down through mothers, right?
Exactly. And the fixation index essentially measures the genetic distance or differences between populations. It gives an indication of how long ago they shared a common ancestor.
Okay, so archaeology and genetics. What else?
And sophisticated paleoclimate data. This comes from ancient climate models, reconstructing what the climate was like thousands of years ago.
So they're not just making educated guesses based on a few scattered archaeological finds. They developed a more sophisticated method.
Exactly. They developed a novel mathematical technique. It accounts for the fact that archaeological finds are inevitably unevenly sampled. We find more stuff in some places than others, and it corrects for those spatial biases in the data.
Clever.
This allowed them to move beyond guesswork and actually identify the most likely and least likely migration trajectories across vast continents. They did this by rigorously testing various scenarios against the data.
What kind of environmental factors did they test?
They meticulously analyzed 6 specific environmental variables. And they reconstructed these variables to correspond with the timing of human arrival in different regions, based on a hindcasted, a sort of backwards-looking atmosphere-ocean general circulation model.
Okay, what were the variables?
They looked at mean annual temperature, mean annual precipitation, mean distance to the nearest coast, percentage of forest cover, mean distance to the nearest main river, and the mean ruggedness of the terrain, how hilly or mountainous it was.
And they built models to see which factors mattered most.
Yes, complex statistical models to see which of these factors best explain the observed patterns of human dispersal derived from the archaeology and genetics.
And what were the surprising findings from this really rigorous approach? What did our early ancestors prioritize? What were they looking for in a new environment as they expanded globally?
The emerging results were truly fascinating, and in some ways they corroborated certain long-held hypotheses about how environment influences behavior, but now with strong empirical backing. They found that our early ancestors, these first global explorers, chose to travel primarily through warm, humid areas with a mix of forest and grasslands near rivers.
Warm, humid, forest, grassland mix near rivers. Okay.
Yeah. While the relative importance of these conditions varied a bit across different geographic regions, the overall pattern was strong. This study provided powerful empirical support for how specific environmental conditions profoundly influenced where these early pioneers migrated, shaping the very routes of human global expansion.
Why those specific conditions? Does it make intuitive sense?
It does. Warmth and humidity would offer a more comfortable living environment, less thermal stress. A mix of forest and grasslands, often called savanna or woodland mosaic environments, provides diverse resources. Forests offer shelter, fuel, timber, certain plant foods. Grasslands support large grazing animals, which were a key food source.
And rivers are obvious, right? Water, transport.
Crucial. Proximity to rivers would have been vital for fresh water, possibly transportation, and abundant aquatic resources like fish and shellfish.
Did the study highlight anything else?
Yes, what's more, their work powerfully underscored biodiversity's role in human survival and mobility to thrive in new environments for thousands of years. They needed diverse ecosystems to provide all the resources they required.
And that has implications for today.
Critically, yes. The study issues a stark warning. The current biodiversity crisis, driven by human impact like habitat destruction and climate change, is now severely compromising our own ability to thrive despite all our advanced technologies. It suggests our future well-being might be more tied to ecological health than we realize.
So the key insight there.
The key insight is that while we often think of early human dispersal as a story of pure human agency, just deciding to go somewhere, it was actually this delicate dance. It was profoundly shaped by and often reliant upon the specific ecological conditions and the biodiversity they encountered along the way.
It seems like we often think of humans as sort of conquering nature, but this research suggests a much more collaborative or maybe adaptive relationship with the environment, even with powerful tectonic forces.
Yeah, adaptive is a good word.
Speaking of which, there's an interesting, almost counterintuitive observation you mentioned earlier about tectonic activity, earthquakes, volcanoes, and the flourishing of ancient civilizations. Why would living in geologically active areas possibly lead to cultural dynamism? Seems like it would just be destructive.
It does seem counterintuitive, doesn't it? But there's this observed spatial correspondence. If you map zones of active tectonism areas prone to frequent earthquakes and volcanism, they often overlap surprisingly well with the locations where many of the great ancient civilizations rose and thrived.
Like where?
Think of the Mediterranean basin, home to ancient Greece and Rome. The Andean regions where the Inca civilization emerged. Parts of East Asia like Japan and China. All tectonically active regions.
Why? Why would that be? One might assume environmental stability would be better for building a civilization. Predictability, less risk.
That's the natural assumption. But the hypothesis here explores the counterintuitive nature of this relationship. It suggests that this frequent exposure to environmental change, from earthquakes reshaping the landscape to volcanic ash fertilizing soils, maybe tsunamis forcing coastal communities to rebuild and adapt, might have correlated with greater cultural dynamism. Perhaps it fostered an underlying expectation of change within these societies.
An expectation of change. That's a fascinating way to put it. How might living in such dynamic environments have spurred adaptability and innovation, rather than simply destroying societies repeatedly?
Well, think about it. Living in environments where the ground literally shifts beneath your feet, where volcanoes erupt and alter the landscape, it means predictability is a luxury you just don't have.
Right. You can't assume things will stay the same.
Exactly. Communities couldn't rely on unchanging conditions. This constant challenge might have spurred several critical societal developments. It could have fostered greater adaptability and resilience in their social structures, forcing them to develop flexible governance systems, maybe better ways to organize collective action for disaster recovery.
Okay, social adaptation. What else?
It likely drove innovation in building techniques. Think about trying to build structures that can withstand seismic forces, maybe using lighter materials or more flexible construction methods, like we see developed in places like Japan. Spiritually, it might have led to rich mythologies and cosmologies that incorporated powerful, unpredictable natural forces, shaping their beliefs and rituals around appeasing or understanding these forces.
And economically, weren't volcanic soils often very fertile?
That's another key point. Volcanic soils are often incredibly fertile, supporting robust agriculture, despite the periodic disruptions from eruptions or quakes. And the constant need to potentially rebuild, re-strategize, and continuously adapt could have fostered a dynamic mindset where ingenuity, flexibility, and collective effort were highly valued traits for survival and success.
So the challenge itself becomes a driver.
It suggests that environmental disruption isn't always a purely negative force in the long run. Sometimes it acts as a powerful selective pressure, cultivating societies that are more robust, creative, and ultimately more capable of long-term survival in an inherently uncertain world. The key insight is that environmental challenge, rather than being solely destructive, can sometimes be a powerful catalyst for human ingenuity and societal resilience, turning geological volatility into a surprising engine of cultural dynamism.
Okay, so Earth's forces have shaped us on this grand geological scale, influencing our evolution, our ancient migrations. Now, let's bring it down to a more intimate human scale. Let's talk about the societies living at the very edges of our modern interconnected world. We're talking about so-called uncontacted tribes. The Sentinelese are probably the most famous example, right? And they've made a very clear, very powerful choice about isolation, haven't they?
Indeed. The Sentinelese are an indigenous tribe inhabiting North Sentinel Island, which is one of the Andaman Islands way out in the Bay of Bengal belonging to India. They are arguably the most iconic example of an uncontacted group. Though, as you rightly point out, it's probably more accurate to describe them as an actively isolated tribe.
Meaning they choose it forcefully.
Exactly. They consistently and vigorously reject any attempts at outside contact. Because of this resolute isolation, very little is actually known about them. Their population is estimated to be very small, likely somewhere between 50 and 150 people. And crucially, no outsider speaks their language.
Not at all.
None that we know of. This underscores the extreme depth of their cultural and linguistic isolation. They are thought to be directly descended from some of the very first human populations to emerge from Africa, maybe having lived in the Andaman Islands for as long as 60,000 years. And the distinctiveness of their language certainly suggests an unparalleled period of long-term isolation and cultural continuity.
Their historical interactions, or maybe more accurately, their lack of interactions, are pretty well documented, aren't they? Marked by this consistent, strong rejection of outsiders. What do we know about why they are so fiercely protective of their isolation?
That's right. Historically, they have shown consistent hostility to outsiders approaching their island, often responding with a flurry or even just a single warning shot of arrows. There's strong speculation this stems from past negative experiences.
Like during colonial times.
Possibly, yes. During the 18th and 19th centuries, when the British attempted to colonize and control the Andaman Islanders, this historical period led to the near decimation of other Andamanese groups, like the Great Andamanese, who we'll probably discuss later. They suffered terribly from invasion, forced relocation, and especially the introduction of diseases against which they had absolutely no immunity.
So the Sentinelese might have seen what happened to their neighbors.
It's highly possible. They might have witnessed or even experienced early, devastating encounters that solidified their absolute resolve to remain isolated for their own survival. However, interestingly, there were brief periods of what looked like peaceful interaction during Indian government gift-giving expeditions. These happened between the 1960s and 1990s.
Gift-giving, what kind of gifts?
Things like coconuts, which don't grow well on their island, and pieces of iron, which they could use for tools and arrowheads. These were occasionally accepted from a distance, but these expeditions ultimately stopped. Because it became abundantly clear that any contact, even seemingly benign gift dropping from boats, carried a profound and unacceptable risk of introducing epidemics. Their complete lack of immunity to common diseases like influenza or measles made any interaction potentially lethal for them.
Is there any sense of what their life is like in isolation?
Very little direct knowledge. But video evidence from the 1990s, taken during one of those rare Indian government contact expeditions from a safe distance, showed them looking extremely healthy, alert, and thriving. It underscored their self-sufficiency and apparent well-being in isolation.
And their resilience was dramatically tested by a huge natural disaster, wasn't it? The massive 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. What did that event reveal about them?
It was a truly profound test. The Sentinelese remarkably survived that devastating tsunami, an event that caused unimaginable destruction across the region.
How do we know they survived?
Evidence came from a single, now iconic, observation. A Sentinelese man was seen standing on the beach, firing an arrow at an Indian Coast Guard helicopter that flew low over the island shortly after the event. The helicopter was assessing damage and looking for survivors.
Wow, so even after that catastrophe, their reaction was still Stay away.
Exactly. That single act spoke volumes about their self-sufficiency, their ability to cope with natural disaster using their own knowledge and resources, and their continued unwavering rejection of outside interference, even in the immediate aftermath of a catastrophe.
They came into the news again more recently, tragically.
Yes, the tragic 2018 killing of the American missionary John Allen Chau, who illegally tried to contact them against Indian law and repeated warnings, that brought them into international headlines again. And it powerfully highlighted their fundamental right to self-determination and their continued expressed desire for non-contact.
But despite their resilience, they might still face environmental threats they can't control.
That's a serious concern. The 2004 tsunami caused significant geological uplift of North Sentinel Island and its surrounding coral reefs. Some estimates suggest parts of the reef were lifted by maybe half a meter to a meter.
And that's bad for the reef.
It can be. Organizations like Cordio, that's Coastal Oceans Research and Development in the Indian Ocean, estimated that these uplifted reefs are unlikely to fully recover. They're now either exposed to air too much during low tides, or the shallower water means increased sunlight intensity and heat stress.
Which could impact their food sources.
Precisely. If the coral reefs degrade significantly, it could fundamentally impact their crucial marine food sources: fish, shellfish, turtles. This raises a really complex question. How do we respect their autonomy when their environment, and thus their very subsistence base, is potentially threatened by large-scale environmental events beyond their control?
A tough question.
The key insight from the Sentinelese, though, remains that their isolation is a conscious, active choice. It seems rooted in a deep understanding, perhaps from historical experience, of the dangers posed by the outside world. This makes their right to self-determination a paramount ethical consideration.
The Sentinelese, then, really stand as this powerful testament to self-determination and chosen isolation. But what happens when that choice isn't honored, or when contact happens anyway, sometimes accidentally, sometimes intentionally? The experiences of other Andamanese tribes, like the Jarwa and the Great Andamanese, paint a very different and often tragic picture, don't they?
They really do. The experiences of the Jarwa tribe, another indigenous group in the Andaman Islands, provide a stark contrast. They began to emerge from isolation and interact more regularly with outsiders around 1996.
And what happened?
The consequences of contact quickly became tragically evident. A devastating measles outbreak occurred among them in 1999. It affected an alarming 40% of their population.
40%. Measles can be deadly for populations without immunity.
Extremely deadly. It was actually Dr. M. Carr, a compassionate government doctor who had been working with them and documenting their health, who intervened crucially. He treated them with ciprofloxacillin, an antibiotic to fight secondary infections, and managed to bring them back from the brink of extinction, as some reports put it.
What was their health like before contact?
Dr. Carr noted that prior to regular contact, they were in exceptionally good health. He described them as well-built and apparently healthier than any other tribal community on the mainland, even better than the common rural people. Things common in modern societies, obesity, hypertension, heart disease, were simply foreign to them. They were perfectly adapted to their environment.
Did Dr. Carr learn anything about their traditional practices? Beyond just physical health, what did we learn about their culture and knowledge systems that were so rapidly threatened by this contact?
Yes, he had the rare privilege of observing some of their traditional medical practices. For instance, they made something called alum, which was a mixture of powdered red clay and pig fat. They used it for minor aches and pains, suggesting a deep knowledge of local resources.
Wow.
He was even invited to witness their 1,000-years-old rich traditional delivery system. He described how women typically gave birth in a squatting position, and the husband often acted as the obstetrician, using a heated hunting knife to cut the umbilical cord.
Incredible self-reliance.
It highlighted their profound self-reliance, their intricate traditional knowledge passed down through generations, and their integrated societal practices where roles were clearly defined and culturally significant. But despite their physical strength and incredible adaptability to their forest environment, diseases introduced by outsiders proved to be their greatest vulnerability. It showed how a seemingly benign element of outside contact, like a common virus, could be absolutely devastating.
And the threats continue for the Jarway, don't they?
Yeah.
Particularly from a road.
Yes, the ongoing threat to their way of life remains significant, particularly from the Andaman Trunk Road. This major road runs directly through their legally protected reserve. Its construction, always a contentious issue, has been described by at least one official as an act of monumental folly.
Why folly?
Because it facilitates illegal incursions into their territory, poaching of animals they rely on, illegal logging, people trying to exploit them, even human safaris where tourists try to spot them. It brings disease, alcohol, and fundamentally disrupts their traditional way of life and their ability to live self-sufficiently. It's a constant source of conflict and threat.
And the great Andamanese, their story's even more tragic, isn't it? A stark historical consequence of sustained contact over a longer period.
Their story is indeed sobering and utterly devastating. It's perhaps the most tragic testament to the consequences of forced contact and colonization. The Great Andamanese refers to a collective of several tribes that once numbered around 5,000 people before the British arrived in the mid-19th century.
5,000, and now?
After sustained contact with outsiders brought devastating epidemics, primarily syphilis and measles, combined with violence, forced relocations, and cultural disruption. They were reduced to just 41 individuals by the early 2000s. Now maybe around 50 or so, but their distinct languages and cultures are largely lost.
From 5,000 to less than 50. That's genocide, effectively.
It exemplifies the broader, almost universal pattern. Forced or uncontrolled contact with isolated tribes has almost universally led to their rapid decimation by diseases to which they have no immunity. Even the common cold or flu can be lethal.
And it's not just disease, is it?
No. Beyond disease, it almost inevitably results in cultural destruction, as traditional ways of life are undermined or forbidden. Exploitation follows, as their land and resources are coveted by settlers or corporations. Displacement from their ancestral territories is common, and often they end up in poverty, as their traditional subsistence methods are rendered ineffective or illegal, leaving them dependent on outside support, often in degrading conditions.
Are there examples outside the Andamans?
Many, unfortunately. Groups like the Ayorio in Paraguay, for instance. They faced aggressive manhunts organized by American fundamentalist missionary organizations like New Tribes Mission, particularly in the 1970s and 80s. These manhunts were intended to force contact and conversion. They resulted in deaths during the contact process, widespread disease outbreaks afterwards, and the fracturing of their communities, forcing many out of the forest into dire conditions in missionary settlements.
So the overarching insight here.
The overarching insight is that the consequences of contact for isolated tribes, especially when it's forced or uncontrolled, are almost invariably catastrophic. It makes non-interference, protecting their isolation, fundamentally a matter of survival for them, not just a matter of preference or abstract rights.
So this brings us to a really difficult ethical crossroads. On one hand, you have this clear, devastating historical evidence of profound harm from contact, this pattern of disease, cultural destruction, exploitation. On the other hand, there's a broader human rights perspective that might argue for intervention in certain circumstances. No. Especially maybe in the face of external threats they can't control, like climate change impacting their environment, or maybe a disease spreading naturally. So does the right to autonomy necessarily mean the right to be left alone, even when their survival might potentially be at stake from these external forces?
This is truly a complex ethical tension. It's perhaps one of the most profound dilemmas in anthropology and human rights today. The dominant view, certainly within human rights organizations like Survival International and reflected in international law, particularly the 2007 UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP.
What does UNDRIP say?
It strongly supports Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination and autonomy, specifically in matters relating to their internal and local affairs. And it affirms their right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions while retaining their right to participate fully, if they choose, in the broader life of the state.
So self-determination is key.
Yes. And crucially, many uncontacted groups are, in fact, well aware of the outside world. They've often seen planes or distant ships or evidence of logging or mining near their territories. They actively choose to remain isolated.
Why? Based on what we know.
Often, it seems, because they've witnessed, maybe from a distance or through encounters generations ago, the devastating negative impacts contact has had on neighboring tribes, the poverty, the exploitation, the destruction of traditional ways of life, the mass epidemics. Their choice for isolation isn't based on ignorance. It's often a rational, informed decision based on ensuring their own survival and continuity.
But then how do you reconcile that with other universal human rights, like the right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, or the right to development, or the reality of those external threats like global climate change or habitat degradation from logging or mining that they didn't cause but profoundly impact their lands and resources? Isn't there an argument that not intervening in some specific dire cases could be seen as a failure to protect them?
That's precisely the core of the dilemma, isn't it? Does the right to autonomy truly entail the absolute right to be left alone, even if their very survival is potentially at stake from external global forces they played no part in creating? This raises the question of whether threats like climate change impacts or massive deforestation driven by global markets are truly just local or internal affairs for these groups anymore. Or does their transboundary nature, the fact they originate outside the tribe's control, warrant some form of external, maybe non-contact intervention focused purely on mitigating that external threat?
It's incredibly thorny.
It is. And it also forces us to critically examine our own perspectives and inherent biases. There is often an inherent ethnocentric bias in assuming that modern society automatically offers an objectively better quality of life for these groups.
Right. We assume our way is the best way.
We have to remember historical perspectives. There's a powerful speech attributed to a Chief Hurrao from Guam in 1671, where he described how the arrival of foreigners brought diseases they never knew, new insects that destroyed their crops, forced labor, and a profound loss of liberty and self-sufficiency. He asked, "What have we gained?" Indigenous communities often possess immense, sophisticated knowledge about their environments and sustainable living practices that modern societies have largely lost or ignored. To assume our way of life is superior, and therefore that intervention is always a benevolent act, is to ignore centuries of devastating historical evidence to the contrary.
Okay, so if direct contact is almost universally agreed by experts and indigenous rights advocates to be harmful, often catastrophic, what are the proposed solutions? What are the strategies for supporting isolated tribes without directly interfering with their chosen way of life? How do you respect their autonomy while acknowledging these potential existential threats? What does an ethical non-contact intervention, if such a thing is even possible, look like?
The consensus among human rights organizations like Survival International and ethical anthropologists leans very strongly toward strict no-contact policies as the primary safeguard. But this needs to be coupled with vigorous efforts to protect their environments and land rights from external encroachment. The guiding principle must be to ensure their survival and their self-determination.
So protecting their territory is paramount.
Absolutely. That's the foundation. Preventing illegal logging, mining, ranching, poaching, or unwanted tourism within or near their lands is critical. This often means legally recognizing their land rights and then actually enforcing those protections on the ground, which is often the hardest part.
Beyond just guarding the borders, are there other ideas? You mentioned non-contact intervention.
Proposed solutions for any kind of intervention, even non-contact, are incredibly challenging and must be approached with the absolute utmost caution and, ideally, only if there's evidence the group itself might desire some form of indirect support for a specific threat. These are highly debated ideas.
Like what, for example?
Well, some have floated ideas like habitat replenishment in buffer zones around their territories, potentially using methods like seed bombing from aircraft to help restore degraded forests, or reintroducing native animal species without direct human presence on the ground. The aim would be to strengthen their resource base without physical contact.
Interesting. What about health needs?
That's even trickier. Another idea, highly controversial, involves implementing policies to indirectly address potential major health threats, perhaps through carefully managed intermediaries, like maybe mixed-race individuals from related previously contacted groups who are culturally and linguistically similar, acting as a potential bridge or buffer for limited exchange of essential knowledge or maybe life-saving medicine in an extreme emergency. But even this carries enormous risk of disease transmission and cultural disruption. It's generally viewed with extreme skepticism.
So mostly it comes back to protecting their land and leaving them alone.
Primarily, yes. Rigorously protecting their land rights and ensuring their isolation is maintained is the most widely accepted ethical approach. It's also critical to consider the broader context of regional development plans. For example, the Indian government body NITI Aayog has proposed large-scale development agendas for the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, focusing on things like tourism and fisheries expansion.
Which could impact tribes like the Sentinelese or Jaroa.
Exactly. These plans raise significant concerns from environmental and anthropological organizations like WWF India and ANET, the Andaman and Nicobar Environmental Team. They worry about long-term sustainability and the potential negative impacts on indigenous rights and territories. The aim, these groups argue, must be to contribute to a development vision that prioritizes social and environmental sustainability and explicitly ensures due concern for the rights, livelihoods, and spaces of indigenous inhabitants, rather than prioritizing top-down economic development at their expense.
So the core insight.
The core insight here is that protecting autonomy for isolated tribes means, first and foremost, rigorously protecting their environment and their territory from external threats and creating a genuine buffer zone. It requires recognizing that their traditional way of life, though different from our own, is not only viable but often highly sustainable and deeply valued by them. Their choice to remain isolated must be respected.
Okay, we've seen these powerful, sometimes devastating examples of how geological forces, climate, and environment have shaped human lives, from ancient migrations to the rise of civilizations, the very survival of modern-day isolated tribes. But, as you alluded to earlier, we need to be incredibly careful not to oversimplify these really complex interactions.
Absolutely crucial.
This brings us to the concept of environmental determinism. What exactly is that, and why has it become so controversial and, frankly, largely discredited in modern academia?
Right. Environmental determinism is a theory, and it's important to stress it's now almost entirely discredited by modern historians, geographers, anthropologists, and other academics that asserted that the physical environment, things like climate, geography, natural resources available, even the topography of the land, was the primary, if not the sole, factor determining human culture, societal development, and historical outcomes.
So where you lived basically dictated who you were and what your society became.
That was the core assertion, yes. It suggested that your environment directly dictated everything from your economic system, hunter-gatherer versus farmer, to your social structures, your political organization, and even your collective character or psychology.
Who came up with this idea?
Proponents like the American geographers Ellsworth Huntington and Ellen Semple were prominent figures in popularizing these ideas historically, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They might argue, for instance, that temperate climates inherently fostered more industrious, innovative, and democratic societies.
While other climates led to less desirable traits.
Exactly. While tropical climates, they might argue, led to more lethargic or backward or despotic cultures because the ease of survival supposedly stifled innovation, or the heat made people less energetic. These were common arguments.
And why did modern academia ultimately reject such a seemingly straightforward idea? I mean, on the surface, it sounds intuitive that environment matters, and it offers a very neat, simple explanation for complex historical patterns.
It does sound intuitive, and that's part of why it was popular for a time, because environment clearly plays some role, obviously, but its flaws are numerous and really significant, leading to its widespread rejection by serious scholars today.
What are the main flaws?
First, it's just a massive oversimplification. It reduces incredibly complex historical issues, things that often span centuries and involve countless interacting factors like social dynamics, economic systems, political decisions, technological developments, cultural beliefs, individual choices, migrations, trade, warfare, all of that, down to a single misleading explanation: geography.
Human history is messier than that.
Far messier. It's a rich tapestry woven with myriad threads, not a simple causal chain dictated solely by climate or terrain. Second, environmental determinism is highly susceptible to confirmation bias.
How so?
Proponents would often unconsciously, or sometimes even deliberately, select only the information that supported their pre-existing arguments. They'd cherry-pick historical examples or scientific data, distorting or ignoring evidence that contradicted their theory just to make their case seem stronger. As the physicist Richard Feynman famously put it, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. Determinists often fell squarely into that trap.
And it had even more problematic implications, didn't it? Particularly in how it was used politically or socially. That seemed like a really serious historical stain.
What's deeply problematic, yes, is its historical usage. Environmental determinism was unfortunately and frequently used to justify colonialist and racist ideologies.
How did that work?
It often implied that certain climates, usually the temperate climates of Europe, bred perfect or superior people, while non-European cultures, particularly those in tropical or arid regions, were deemed backward or inherently less capable because of their environment. This provided a convenient pseudoscientific justification for European colonialism, exploitation, slavery, and even violent subjugation. It basically said these people are incapable of governing themselves properly because of where they live, so it's our duty right to rule them.
That's chilling. Even if someone tries to use environmental factors to explain history without racist intent, can it still be problematic? You mentioned Jared Diamond's guns, germs, and seal earlier.
That's a really important point. Even well-intentioned works, like Jared Diamond's hugely popular and influential book Guns, Germs, and Steel, which explicitly aim to disprove racist reasoning by providing environmental and geographical explanations for why Eurasian societies came to dominate others technologically and politically. Even that book has faced criticism from many historians and anthropologists.
What's the criticism? He wasn't being racist.
No, his intent was clearly anti-racist. But the critique is that despite his noble intentions, the book's strongly deterministic framing, arguing that continental axis orientation, availability of domesticable plants and animals, and disease pools were the primary drivers of global inequality, inadvertently risks being co-opted to support notions of inherent superiority or inferiority. By reducing complex human choices, cultural developments, political histories, and historical accidents largely to environmental outcomes, it can still feel like it minimizes the agency and achievements of non-European peoples, even while trying to explain their different historical trajectory non-racially. It raises an important question. Can we discuss environmental influence powerfully without falling back into the trap of determinism and its potential for misuse?
So another major flaw was that it largely ignored the human element, the agency of people to make choices, innovate, overcome challenges, regardless of their environment.
Absolutely. That's a fundamental reason for its rejection. It fundamentally ignored human agency and crucial cultural factors. It neglected the profound role of human choices, cultural adaptations, social behaviors, intellectual exchange, technological innovation, political organization, religious beliefs, and just plain historical contingency accidents and unexpected events in shaping societies.
We aren't just puppets of geography.
Exactly. Humans are not passive recipients of environmental dictates. We actively adapt to our environments, yes, but we also actively transform our environments through things like agriculture, irrigation, building cities. And our cultures are products of far more than just geography. They're shaped by history, by ideas, by interactions with other cultures. Think of the Inuit developing incredibly sophisticated survival techniques and rich cultures in the Arctic, or ancient Egyptians building a massive civilization and flourishing in a desert environment through advanced irrigation and social organization. Determinism can't easily explain that kind of ingenuity.
Did the specific claims hold up scientifically?
Largely, no. Many of its specific claims, such as simplistic direct links between a specific climate type and inherent human character traits, like industriousness or laziness, consistently lacked rigorous empirical support when subjected to proper scientific scrutiny across diverse cultures and historical periods. And critically, these deterministic theories were often built backwards from existing historical outcomes.
What do you mean, built backward?
They started with the observed outcome, say, European dominance in the 19th century, and then looked for environmental factors that could explain it, rather than formulating a hypothesis about environmental influence and then rigorously testing it against multiple independent historical cases, including those that might contradict the hypothesis. That backward construction is not a robust scientific or historical method. It's prone to finding patterns where none exist or misattributing causes.
Okay, so environmental determinism is out. What's the modern, more nuanced view then? How do historians, geographers, and social scientists talk about the environment's role today without falling into that determinist trap? What does complex causation really mean in practice?
The modern, nuanced view absolutely recognizes that the environment influences human societies, sometimes profoundly. But it's understood as one among many interacting variables. It's part of a complex, dynamic web that also includes social structures, economic systems, political decisions, cultural values, technological capabilities, demographics, and historical legacies.
So environment is a factor, not the factor.
Precisely. The key distinction is that modern studies focus on complex causation. They acknowledge environmental influence, pressures, constraints, and opportunities, but they firmly reject monocausal explanations that claim environment determines outcomes. We ask, how does the environment shape the possibilities and pressures that people face, rather than claiming it dictates their destiny?
Can you give an example of complex causation in practice?
Sure. A modern historian analyzing, say, the decline of a medieval society wouldn't just point to a period of drought and say, see, climate did it. They would explore how that drought interacted with existing political instability, maybe social inequality that made peasants more vulnerable, the state of their trade routes, the limitations of their agricultural technology, and their specific cultural responses to hardship, maybe religious interpretations or social coping mechanisms.
Looking at how all the pieces fit together.
Exactly. They'd look at how different societies, perhaps facing similar environmental challenges like that drought, might respond in vastly different ways due to their unique cultural frameworks, political leadership, or social structures. Some might collapse, others might adapt and innovate, others might migrate. The environment presents challenges and opportunities, but how humans respond is shaped by a whole host of other factors.
So it allows for a much richer picture.
A much richer, more accurate understanding of human history and our ongoing intricate relationship with the planet. We move from a simplistic, often misleading linear cause and effect model, environment society, to a dynamic, multi-layered interaction where environment, culture, society, and individual agency all influence each other in complex feedback loops. The crucial takeaway isn't that environment doesn't matter, it absolutely does, but that its influence is always woven into this complex tapestry of human history, agency, and cultural evolution.
Wow. Okay. This deep dive has truly laid bare this profound and intricate dance between Earth's dynamic systems and human societies. It's incredible. From those almost imperceptible, precise measurements of ground deformation using satellites and even barnacles, measurements that inform our understanding of seismic hazards, to the millennia-long shaping of human migration patterns by colossal volcanic eruptions and shifting climates, and even right up to the contemporary dilemmas of cultural contact, self-determination for isolated groups, and avoiding the pitfalls of determinism. The planet is clearly not just a passive backdrop to our story.
Not at all.
It is an active, powerful participant,
Yeah.
constantly influencing our past, our present, and undoubtedly our future, challenging us to adapt, to understand, and maybe to respect its immense power.
So thinking about everything we've covered, from coseismic deformation to the sentinels, what stands out to you, our listener? Consider how our increasing ability to measure and predict Earth's movements combined with this growing awareness of our complex historical interactions with the environment. How might that shift our responsibilities, both towards our planet itself and towards the diverse human communities, some still living quite literally at its edges? How does understanding these deep connections, the geology, the ecology, the human story, all intertwine, change how you view humanity's place on Earth and our ongoing story?